Traditional low-carb diets, these high-protein, high-fat diets that go under many names like Scarsdale and Stillman and Atkins and Zone and South Beach and Dukan. And then we have promoters, very strong promoters. Any of you on the internet, you hear of the Weston Price Foundation headed by Mary Enig and Sally Fallon. And then we have Gary Taubes out there writing articles in the New York Times about how good Atkins is and how bad it is to eat carbs. So they have their army. And they're traditional. They've been going on for years. Actually, more than what I just listed. This high-protein, high-fat, low-carb philosophy has been going on that I know of for more than 100 years. But we have a new low-carb movement. And they disguise themselves as being healthy. And what they do is they are really apologists for the traditional Atkins diet of butter and brie. They are apologists in the sense that they add lots of what we call non-starchy green and yellow and orange vegetables. And somehow that's supposed to compensate for all the animal foods, all the meat and the dairy that is added by adding these extra non-starchy. In other words, no bread, no rice, no corn, no potatoes. To compensate for that, the idea of eating all the meat you want, or pretty much all the meat that you want, is to add these green and yellow vegetables. And these diets come under the name of paleo, Paleolithic diets, paleo diet, caveman diet, Stone Age diet, hunter-gatherer diet. That brings up a lot of thoughts for you, doesn't it? The traditional diet of people. In fact, the theory is this, is that our ancestors ate a diet primarily of meat. They were hunter-gatherers with the emphasis on hunter, and as a result of 2 million plus years of evolution, we evolved to be hunter-gatherers with the emphasis on hunter. We evolved to eat lots and lots of meat. So they tell us, meat, that's good. You can eat fish and chicken and beef and pork, any kind of animal food. Seafood is great. Oh yes, you can have these non-starchy green and yellow vegetables. Fruits, they're okay too. But don't you dare eat bread or potatoes or rice, because these are evil. These are the foods that contain lots of carbohydrate. These are what I call starches. Those are forbidden. And to their credit, they do forbid some things that I think are not good for you, as well as you can easily recognize as not being good for you. They forbid dairy. They forbid sugar. They forbid oils, except for maybe olive oil. The Bible of Paleo Diet was written by a man named Loren Cordain. He's a PhD. He works for Colorado State University. Anybody who's involved in this paleo idea, these paleo nutritions, also goes under primal nutrition or primal diets. Anybody that's involved in these types of programs, they look up to Loren Cordain as their hero. He wrote the Bible, the Paleo Diet, and I've read this book. As a matter of fact, in the slides that follow, you'll see parentheses, which represent page numbers from this particular book, if you want to go back and see the actual quotes that were made for this book. Cordain says that the paleo diet is the one and only diet that ideally fits our genetic makeup. He claims that every human being on Earth ate this way for the past 2.5 million years. Everyone. In fact, he says there wasn't a single person who did not follow the paleo diet. Now that brings up a little suspicion, doesn't it? Well, it should bring up a lot of suspicion. Where he comes to this understanding is where a lot of people, poorly educated people who are not up with the scientific literature, people of old, 40, 50, 100 years ago, who used to do archaeologic diggings, what they did is that they dug around a village, the campfire site and so on, and they looked for remnants of people who lived 100, 200, 1,000,000 years ago. What they found is they found bones. They found tools, stone tools, for example. They found cuts on the bones. They didn't find any pea pods, no orange peels, no corn husks after 50,000 years. So their conclusion was that these people obviously were primarily hunters, because all we could see is evidence of animal eating by that crude kind of archaeology. And by the way, all archaeologists the majority of the archaeology community, if not all of them, recognize that this was the problem for coming up with incorrect theories. And so when doctors started looking around for other remnants of what people eat, they found some clues that we really weren't that big of meat eaters. I believe, by the way, that there were probably no societies in the past, or large societies today even, that lived on a pure vegan diet. Let's face it, people ate some animal foods throughout most of human history, but the idea that they ate a lot of plant foods in their diet had to come from some more careful archaeology. What they had to do is look for different evidence of plant eating, like these right here. These are called starch granules or amyloplasts. They're parts of a cell. Inside of a plant cell is stored starch. Starch is long chains of sugar, either straight chains or branching chains, called amylose and amylopectin. And these chains, which are made as a consequence of photosynthesis by plants, plants make these sugars, glucose, and turn them into chains for their own use. They store this sugar for their own needs, like to make it through the winter. Or when spring comes, you need energy to sprout anew, to become a new plant. And so the plant stores its energy inside its cells, or cytoplasm, in the form of these vacuoles called amyloplasts, starch grains or starch granules. Investigators have looked into archaeologic findings and found evidence of these starch granules and other plant parts that have lasted eons. For example, 2 million years. Recent archaeologic findings that date back 2 million years, when they looked at the dentition, the teeth of the remains of people that lived 2 million years ago, they found parts of fruits, parts of wood bark, parts of grass, parts of sledge. In other words, evidence as far as 2 million years ago that people ate like chimpanzees and other lesser primates do today. From 105,000 years ago in East Africa, Mozambique, when they dug around the village site, what they found is they found these starch granules, these cubicle-type starch granules. They're from grains. The ones that are more round are from underground storage organs like potatoes and various other tubers and roots. So you see, they found these particular parts of plants preserved for 100,000 years. They found them on the tools, and their conclusion is that people were consuming grains and other plant parts for 105,000 years or more. The Neanderthal is the ultimate in the meat eater in people's minds. When they think about primates that are very close to the current human, people think about the Neanderthal, and the immediate thought is this is the ultimate hunter, gatherer. But evidence is that's not the case. They looked at skeletons of Neanderthals all the way from the cold north of Europe down to the sunny Mediterranean, and they found in these skeletons, they found evidence of starch eating when they looked between the teeth of these various skeletons. Dating back 44,000 years, they found these starch granules. And these starch granules match starch granules that we can make today just by cooking various starches like potatoes. The bottom row shows pictures of starch granules from current foods that were cooked in laboratories and photographed. The one at the top represents starch grains, starch granules, amyloplasts from 44,000 years ago from Neanderthals. So we have clear evidence that the Neanderthals ate cooked starch. When this article came out, which is in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, the headlines in the internet were the end of the Paleolithic diets. Because what these findings were of 3 separate populations in Europe. They looked at the grinding tools, and what they found from these 3 separate populations in Europe dating back 30,000 years ago. Remember, according to the Paleolithic theory, according to the Paleo Diet Bible, before 10,000 years ago, nobody ate these foods. And yet they found evidence of abundant use of various starches in 3 separate populations in Western Europe. 14,000 years ago, that's before 10,000 years ago, we have evidence of organic material being consumed by people. To find that evidence, you had to look in a special situation. This was 150 miles south of Santiago, Chile. This is an excavation site that was covered up eons ago by peat bog. And so the peat preserved the organic material. One of the few cases where we can actually find evidence dating back 14,000 years of actual organic material that were used by people. This is the first evidence of potato eating. 44 different edible kinds of plants were found in this excavation. 22 different kinds of medicinal plants were found in this excavation. Clear evidence that people were plant eaters. Now you date more recent findings, 8,000 years ago in western Peru. What they found were 7 skeletons. They looked between the teeth of the skeleton. You can see the teeth in this particular photograph. They looked in the teeth of the skeletons, and when they looked between the teeth, what did they find? They found these. These are starch granules. Again, clear evidence that people were starch eaters. Wherever you look in the world where we have clear historical evidence, we have documentation, written documentation, not just fragments of people's civilization, but written documentation of what people have eaten. What we find is that all large, successful populations of people throughout all of verifiable, recordable history have consumed the bulk of their calories in starch. These are examples that you knew about long before you met me. You knew that the Aztecs and the Mayans were the people of the corn. They lived on corn. And a little further south, you have the Incas, who lived on potatoes. If you've been to Peru, you still know that's their culture today. And the Peruvians, the Incas, they lived on potatoes primarily until they went to battle, and then they switched to quinoa because they thought that offered more strength. You can look to the Middle East. That used to be the breadbasket of the world. That's where people lived on bread made from barley and wheat. It powered civilizations for tens of thousands of years. And then you look to the Far East, and what do you see? Even today, people from Thailand and Cambodia and China and Japan, they're rice eaters. In fact, the good morning greeting in China, instead of saying, "How are you?" it's, "Have you had your rice today?" That's how important rice is in those particular cultures. There are 1.73 billion Asians who live on rice-based diets. And people tell you rice makes you fat. Well, where are those fat Asians? In the United States, right? They gave up their rice. All right, getting back to the philosophy of the paleo diets. In the paleo diet, you're encouraged. In fact, the basis of this diet is meat. 55% of your food should come from animal sources. That's beef, poultry, fish, eggs. 55% of your diet can come from these particular foods. The typical fare of things that you're familiar with, like beef and veal and pork and chicken, but they also tell you it is good. And you certainly aren't discouraged, if not encouraged, to eat some animals that you don't typically think of as food, like alligators and snakes and deers and bears and so on. Nothing's off the menu. You can basically eat anything that ever walked, crawled, or swam on this kind of diet. And they actually offer mail-order suppliers for these wild animals in this book. Yeah. They even tell you that the old people, the Paleolithic people from 2.5 million years ago to 10,000 years ago, that's the Paleolithic period, that they lived on, as part of their diet, bone marrow and brains. I think that's a bit repulsive, don't you? But we're supposed to eat like our ancestors do. We're supposed to eat brains and bone marrow of animals, and if we're really supposed to eat like our ancestors do, don't forget one delicacy, which was adolescents and children. Yeah, it's called nutritional cannibalism. That means eating fellow human beings for nutrition and enjoyment. And you see evidence that was found almost 1 million years ago of people who were butchered with slices across their bones that were put there by stone tools of the people of that time. Yeah, so I guess if you're going to be a true paleo follower, you really must eat like your ancestors. Well, these diets are a nutritional nightmare. There have been many articles published about the hazards of these low-carb, high-protein, high-fat diets, all the way from Atkins to paleo. And the British Medical Journal just came out a few months ago and published the results of these low-carb, high-protein diets in a large analysis. And they said that these increase your risk of cardiovascular disease, particularly in women. The conclusions are clear from scientific research and the summaries that have been provided that these diets are dangerous. whenever anybody comes out with these kinds of broad statements that are heard worldwide, folks in the Atkins Nutraceuticals, their Atkins Foundation, they respond back by threatening lawsuits. Yeah, well, you know, they did that with Nathan Pritikin 30 years ago. They'll try it again today. But I think the public is so well aware, the scientific community is so solid, the evidence is so unrefutable that these foods are dangerous, no matter how hard and how often they tell you otherwise. These foods are a health hazard. But I guess if you repeat a lie often enough, it becomes true. And they do that. They have a large megaphone to talk to people about something that often they like to hear. People love to hear good news about their bad habits. Tell me it's good to eat pork chops. You know, well, people often fall into that because of their own personal habits. However, if you look at the evidence, the clear scientific evidence, the experiments done in laboratories, and also the population experiments, what you find is that people thrive on diets low in meat, low in dairy, and high in starches. Like, for example, there are the blue zones, which were published in National Geographic the first time. And this is a study of the various populations of people who are most long-lived in the world. And what these populations, be they from Okinawa, Japan, Sardinia, Italy, Nicoya, Costa Rica, Greece, or the Seventh-day Adventists right here in California, what they all have in common is they're near vegetarian. They eat starch-based diets. Now, what better evidence that you could have than just looking at people who currently are alive and well and thriving and longest lived? What kind of diets do they eat? Well, they don't eat low-carb diets. They eat high-carb diets, starch-based diets with fruits and vegetables, and minimal amounts of animal food intake. And that is an absolutely consistent finding. And then we also have major studies that have been done over the last 50 years, and research that has impressed the world, like, for example, Walter Kempner at Duke University. In 1939, he started the rice diet at Duke University. It was the most financially successful thing about Duke University for 4 decades, the rice diet in Durham, North Carolina. Walter Kempner is one of probably my most important medical heroes. He fed people who were sick with severe heart disease, diabetes, arthritis. He fed them a diet of white rice, because that was most available and most acceptable. I know, terrible white rice, but that's what you got. You got white rice. And you got some fruits. And you got a little sugar to make up for the calories. And he took people with failing kidneys, with hearts so big that if you took a chest x-ray, that's all you saw in the chest x-ray was heart. He took people with abnormal EKG findings, people who were dying, and they switched them off their typical American diet to the rice diet of rice and fruits and sugar, and maybe a little later on, if you got healthy, you got some vegetables, and then a little bit of meat, maybe later on. And he cured people with terrible illnesses, you know, long before I was born. And then you have Nathan Pritikin doing the same thing and publishing the results in our scientific journals. And as I talked to you about last night, Dr. Roy Swank, who worked as the head of neurology for 25 years at Oregon Health and Science University, he used a diet very low in saturated fat. And you know what saturated fat means? That means meat and dairy. And he essentially cured people with multiple sclerosis. So the major scientific treatments based upon diets are based upon high-carb, low-meat diets, not otherwise. These kinds of diets, let's just say it were true, and that people should be eating a paleo diet. In fact, I've often thought if I ever get a chance to be on a television program with one of the folks who recommend these low-carb, high-protein, high-fat, paleo-type, Atkins-type diets, and they started battling with me about the research. And you can look at lots of research, you can interpret it in various ways, and you know, people can be very selective and cherry pick what they want to talk about. And I could just see the audience out there getting all confused. Well, you got your studies that say that eating a high-carb diet cures diabetes, but Atkins has his study that says that eating a low-carb diet will cure diabetes. Yeah, because it makes them so sick they lose weight, and then their diabetes goes away. That's why that works. But I may not have a chance to say that. So you get through all this argument, all this confusion, all this battling going on, and then what I plan on saying is, yeah, but even if you were right, what are the environmental and planetary and future consequences if we adopted that kind of diet? What would be the consequences? It would be an ecological disaster. We're heading for the brink of destruction of the planet Earth and its inhabitants right now. It would rapidly hurry up that destruction if that occurred. Right now, there are organizations like World Watch Institute that estimate more than 51% of the greenhouse gases are a direct consequence of producing animal foods for people. A more conservative estimate comes from the World Health Organization, their publication in November of 2006 called Livestock's Long Shadow. They estimated that 18% of the greenhouse gases are from livestock production, as opposed to 13 to 14% that you heard last night is due to all transportation. It would be a disaster for planet Earth if people adopted this kind of eating widespread. And they are. I mean, more and more they are. You hear a lot more about paleo eating and Atkins eating than you do hear about high-carb eating. I don't know, maybe that's not true. Vegetarian's becoming pretty darn popular, isn't it, with Bill Clinton and Michelle Pfeiffer and other celebrities standing up. I mean, people who are beautiful people who are getting healthier and handsomer as the days go on because they've made this simple change. I don't know, maybe we're winning. I hope so. Another report has to do with our water supply. It takes, and this impressed me, 4,000 to 18,000 gallons of water to produce one juicy hamburger. Yeah. At the end of his book, Dr. Cordain, and by the way, this is the picture on the left-hand side that he uses on his current book. I don't know where the heck this came from. I guess high school graduation. But that's his current picture he uses on his book. This happens, the one on the other side of the frame is the result of 20 years of eating the paleo diet. At the end of the book, in the additions he puts in his new revision of the paleo diet, he says, without them, starches like wheat, corn, and potatoes, the world could probably support 1/10 or less of the present population. You know, we have an overpopulation problem. Nobody questions it. There are solutions out there for handling the overpopulation, such as what China did, which is 1 child per family. There are other solutions out there that are even less popular, like a viral epidemic, or maybe some type of catastrophic war to reduce the population. But let's just say that's not an option on the table to reduce the population. At current population, according to Cordain, we could support 1/10 of the people. So what I want you to do right now is I want you to pick 10 of your friends or family members out and choose which 9 will die so that people can eat the paleo diet. Because Cordain says you cannot support the current population without starches. So 9 of 10 of your friends and family members are out of here. They must go if we're going to do something as uncivilized as eating the paleo diet, which is destroying animals and the planet, and would have to, based on Cordain's calculations, would have to take and eliminate 90% of the population on planet Earth. The next question you come to when you talk about hunter-gatherers is, what is it about hunter-gatherers that makes them healthy? Is it because of what they ate? You know, it might not be. It might be because they exercised a lot. Maybe that's why. Some of your friends will say that. You know, those people in Japan, the reason that they're so thin and healthy looking, not because of the rice, it's because they exercise so much. Well, you know, people in these less developed countries like China, well, China, that's not less developed anymore, is it? But in parts of the world that have been traditionally less developed, yeah, some people work harder. They're out in the farm, in the fields, and they're plowing the fields by hand, and they're harvesting the crops and so on, but there are a lot of people in these societies who don't do that. They're school teachers and bankers and ministers and writers and public speakers, and they don't exercise. But they're all trim, aren't they? Anyway, looking back at the paleo issue, scientists looked at traditional hunter-gatherers. In this case, they looked at the Hadza tribes, and these are people who are in north-central Tanzania. And they studied these populations of people, and they carefully looked at their energy expenditures. And what they found is these traditional hunter-gatherers, which are trim, healthy, hardy people without heart disease, people who don't have the traditional types of diets that we have. They eat healthier diets, of course, less refined food, and not so many animal products either. They do some hunting, yeah. The men go out and they try and catch an animal here or there or get a little bit of honey. But most of the food supply is obtained by the less important people, you know, the grandparents, the women, the children, even in those societies. Well, when they measure their energy expenditures of the traditional hunter-gatherer populations, they don't expend any more energy than people living in Western societies. It's not exercise. It's the food. Not to tell you exercise isn't of value, but that's a scapegoat. You've got to fix the food. In February of 2010, we had a special guest here. That was Dr. Nathaniel Dominy. Did anybody come to hear that presentation? Yeah, I worked for 4 years to get Dr. Dominy to come to this advanced study weekend right here in the room. And Dr. Dominy gave a presentation. It was actually in February of 2011, wasn't it? Sure. February 2011. Dr. Dominy gave a presentation about his work on diet and evolution. That's what he specializes at Dartmouth College. And he told you about the historical data. He told you about the genetics of human beings that make us starch eaters. And he gave a presentation that those of you who heard it will never forget.
And so what do we tell our friends and relatives who tell us that we're primarily meat eaters because we're hunter-gatherers? With an emphasis on hunter because that's, you know, the man thing to do, and gathering's the woman thing to do.
That's a myth. Hunters and gatherers, the majority of their calories come from plant foods. Yeah.
So
that's a myth. Hunters and gatherers, the majority of all the calories that any hunting and gathering population gets comes from its plant foods. So that's what's most reliable. Meat is just too unpredictable. You can't rely on it.
So kind of as a summary statement, as an expert anthropologist, you know, you've spent your whole life studying the human diet and its relationship to teeth and bones and chemicals and genes and so on. Your conclusion is the human being is a
starchivore.
Could I use that in my new book?
Okay, sure.
Thank you very much.
Sure thing.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Anyway, you know, the truth is clear in the anthropological community. The scientists know better. As a matter of fact, when I wrote the article on the Paleo Diet in the June 2012 newsletter, I sent it to many of the famous anthropologists around the country, and the responses I got back were all positive. They thanked me for doing the summary I did, and the title of the article is "The Paleo Diet is Uncivilized, Unhealthy, and Untrue." That's what I wrote. And the anthropologic community, by and large, agrees with that. All right, so these are the boundaries that I see and have defined as where the diet wars exist. It's between good and evil. I don't know any other way to say it. It's between good and evil. Good, you know what side I believe that is. It's the people who recommend plant foods that are healthy for people, healthy for the planet, and of course, healthy for the animals. And then there's the evil side that destroys people's lives. It destroys the beautiful animals on this planet, and it's destroying planet Earth itself. Those are the battle lines.